Okay.
Can you get the zooms to like the thumbs to float up on Zoom at this point?
Yes.
Absolutely. Welcome, everybody. We are so excited. Thank you for joining us on this Wednesday afternoon to share our case study presentation. Um, as we mentioned, as you come in, please just keep introducing yourself and getting used to that chat. We want to welcome you to Coffee and Quality's presentation for this case study number 7. As always, just some ground rules. We are here to learn from each other. We are here to explore data and evaluation. This is a safe place, and we encourage you to use the chat if you have any questions as they come up. Go ahead and throw them in the chat. There will be a Q&A at the end, but we want to make sure we capture all that information. As always, if you are not yet a member of our Teams channel and you would like to be, all you have to do is drop your email in the chat and we will make sure to get you added to that. It's a great place to explore resources and get updates, including this research brief that we'll get after this case study. So those are my commercials. That's it. That's all the commercials we have today. Because we need to get into the real reason why we're here. The real reason why we are here is to share out some findings from our 7th case study. So we've been very lucky to continue this partnership with the Kinder Institute and now the Masters of Social Policy Evaluation at Rice University to help nonprofits really dig into a research question, build in with that partnership, explore their data, and really get deep in a space that maybe they wouldn't normally have time to do on their own with their own resources. So that's the case study, and that's what we're doing here today. And we're so excited to learn what our 7th case study, DACAMERA, has in store. So you can see our previous ones and going into this 7th one. So here's how the process works for a case study, right? It's a 6-month commitment. We begin by finding a nonprofit who's ready to get some big questions answered and might need some support doing that. And then we get into some sharing and some vulnerability, figuring out how to find that information, dig into the data collaboratively. And then we get to this place right now where we get to share that back out with the community for the individual nonprofit to learn, but also for the greater nonprofit community here in Houston to learn vicariously through these findings. And then we'll process all of those, and a beautiful report will come out, and you guys will make sure you get access to that as well. And it's something that our nonprofits get to keep, as well as the greater community gets to access. So, with that being said, I am delighted that we are featuring again our 7th case study, DACAMERA, and I will hand it over to Brandon to share all about DACAMERA.
All right. Hello, everybody. It is a joy to be here, and thank you all for taking time out of your day to go over our case study with us. We've been excited to work with Dan and the team at Kinder and at Rice and the United Way. It's been a fantastic experience. So I just want to kind of share a little bit about DACAMERA. If you want to go to the next slide, you'll see our logo again. So DACAMERA, we are a chamber music and jazz presenter here in Houston. Next slide. Our mission is to inspire individuals and enrich communities through diverse and inventive musical experiences. We do that in a number of ways that I'll get to in a minute. We just kind of want to give a big picture as to kind of how we impact our community. Next slide, please. So you can see we have an estimated annual reach of 30,000 people that are local to our community. It's also cultural tourists. About more than half of our average annual reach is students. We do a lot of work out in HISD and other districts around the area, a lot of community centers, things like that. So, we're proud of the reach that we're able to get to in Greater Houston. We're a relatively small organization. We just welcomed our 12th full-time staff member a couple weeks ago. So we're growing, but we're still relatively small compared to some of our other colleagues in the theater district, like Houston Symphony, the opera, the ballet. Um, Next slide, please. So our programming, I kind of put our programming into three buckets that we'll talk about. First is kind of our concert series, what kind of most people know us for. So we have a main stage concert series where we focus on chamber music and jazz. We perform downtown in the Cullen Theater, at the Wortham Theater Center, also at Zilka Hall at the Hobby Center. We have a very special and unique series here in our neighborhood at the Menil Collection. Um, and then we also, each season, we have a couple of ancillary locations. This year, we'll be presenting and partnering with Rothko Chapel on some concerts in February. And then we're really excited to mark a new partnership with the Ismaili Center for concerts in April. Really excited about that. So that's kind of our main stage series. We also have DACAMERA at the El Dorado Rising Jazz Stars. That's a relatively new series. We're just entering our third season of that. And that is, we bring nationally known kind of up and coming artists on the jazz scene to Houston. Most often it's their Houston debut. So we bring them to the legendary El Dorado Ballroom, which if you haven't been, it's been really beautifully restored over the past couple of years. So we're excited to partner with El Dorado Ballroom and Project Row Houses to kind of activate that space in the way that it was meant to. It was meant to be. It's kind of Houston's original listening room for jazz. So our main stage series has around 20 to 22 concerts each season, and then our El Dorado series has 4 dates. Those are all Sundays, Sunday like late afternoon, early evening, just 1 hour set. Next slide, please. Community at our core. Something we're very proud of is our work by our Education and Community Initiatives Department. We have a young artist program at DACAMERA that it's a pre-professional training program for composers, instrumentalists, and vocalists. And the goal of the program is to kind of turn them into citizen artists. So we want these outstanding young musicians, a lot of whom are studying at Rice or U of H. We want them out into the community and building community through their music making. So we have a curriculum called Music Encounters, and that's arts integrated lessons that we deliver actually in classrooms. So, we're not in the cafegimatorium, not that there's anything wrong with that, but we're actually in a classroom, and, a flutist may be teaching a lesson on, social emotional learning or math or science. So it's tied to the actual curriculum and the actual teaching that's happening inside the classroom. Our young artists, they go through this entire program, professional development workshops. We do around 10 or 12 workshops with them each year, where they're introduced to professionals, both locally and then nationally. They get headshots. They get a lot of other professional development opportunities as well. And so they're the ones kind of who are on the front lines of doing all of our community concerts. We do around 55 or 60 free community concerts in addition to the main stage concerts that I just spoke about. So our young artists are performing all over town, at the Menil, at the MFAH, in hospitals. They have a residency at Harris County Juvenile Probation Department. So they're just out there kind of impacting many aspects of our community. Next up. And this is kind of the third programmatic prong that DACAMERA does. This is new. DACAMERA Editions, it's actually a record label that DACAMERA has just launched within the past year. And it's kind of dedicated to I feel like DACAMERA has a really distinctive programmatic and artistic approach. And this DACAMERA Editions kind of gets that out to a wider audience. So we have 2 albums out so far: Tyshawn Sore's Monochromatic Light Afterlife. That was our first album that came out in January. It's written up in the New York Times. We're very excited about it. This piece actually we commissioned, and it was a finalist for the 2023 Pulitzer Prize in music. Um, so that was our first album, and then our second album was a solo work by our brilliant artistic director, pianist Sarah Rothenberg. That came out in May, and we'll be announcing our next release coming up soon, and then we have the next two or three for next season. So that's been really outstanding. And again, it's kind of our third programmatic prong to what we're doing. We actually just shipped out a CD the other day to Denmark. So it's been really fantastic for just growing the organization's brand and just kind of getting our name out there. Next slide. This is just a brief history of DACAMERA. So founded in 1987, this current season we will be opening in it's 2 months from tomorrow. I just realized will be our 39th season. So we've in the 39 years we've kind of really grown and established ourselves as one of the premier presenting and producing organizations really in the country. We're really proud of the work that we do, and we kind of put our programming up against really anybody in the country. You can just see some highlights there. Sarah Rothenberg, our artistic director, who I just spoke about, she's been here since 1994. So it's really kind of been her vision that has really allowed the organization to grow. And then lastly, the next slide. Oh, there's supposed to be one more slide. Oh well, there's not. Maybe anyway. So while I would be remiss if I didn't say, as I as I just said, we're about to start our 39th season. Tickets are still available. So you can go to our website, dacamera.com, or maybe we'll share out emails, but we would love to welcome you to concerts. I think we have something that's very unique and special within Houston, and I think there's something for everybody. Um, so with that, again, I thank you for being here. I thank United Way and the Kinder Institute and Rice, and I pass it over to Dan. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that, Brandon. And yes, to echo Brandon, thank you all so much for joining us here today as we talk about the research study that we were able to do in partnership with DACAMERA and United Way this summer. We're very excited to present what we learned, and for that, my colleagues will be doing the bulk of that work. But before we hand it off to them, I want to start by just sort of describing a little bit about the study, what our goals have been for this, and the process that we used. And so if we can head on to the next slide. Excellent. So, next slide. Wonderful. So for the presentation of our results today, what we're going to do is, again, we're going to start by outlining the goals of this capstone case study. What are we trying to do? A little bit of DACAMERA work, but also that broader nonprofit community, and how are we learning from this in that respect? We're going to touch on the process that we're using, and specifically looking at the partnership model that gets applied. And then we're going to hand things over to my colleagues who are going to talk about our research questions, the different analysis plans that were used to go about answering those research questions. Obviously, the very interesting, what did we find, the results of those, and then we're going to transition over back to our friends over at DACAMERA to start talking about, okay, so what does all of this mean? And so let's talk a little bit about the goals of the capstone case study. So Brandon mentioned earlier that DACAMERA has multiple facets about what it is doing and up to. And so I want to start by sort of honing us in on the particular facet that we were focused on as part of this case study, which was around this, key of community. DACAMERA was very, very interested in understanding what communities was it serving. And so in order for us to try to get some insights into those communities that are being served, we were utilizing ticket data for their various different performances, specifically their jazz and chamber performances, to understand where patrons were coming from. And by understanding where patrons were coming from, it gives us that opportunity to understand what are the communities that are being served. In addition to understanding the communities that are being served, we're also interested in how do we keep serving those communities? In other words, how do we get patrons, how do we get those ticket holders who are here today to come back again and again, and in particular, coming back next season. And so we're going to be looking at analyses to understand that sort of patron journey, if you will, what connects folks, not just today with DACAMERA and DACAMERA's offerings, but into the future as well. And so now those are going to be specific goals focused on the questions DACAMERA was raising and obviously of interest to them with their own data. But we also want to make sure that we're taking that time to zoom out and recognize that even while this research project was focused on DACAMERA, there are things that we were learning, whether it has to do with data, data collection, data storage, and that those lessons apply to anyone and everyone who is handling and working with data. And so there's that broader, wider nonprofit application that we will also be looking to discuss and talk through as well. So those are the goals of this capstone case study. In terms of the process that we used, and this will be, here we go. Allison did a wonderful job touching on this already, so I do not necessarily want to try to just recreate that beautiful description earlier, but just to hit on the importance that this project is not being done in isolation at Rice University, where we're sitting in a room pondering what's of interest to us. This project is very much centered on partnership, which involves that co-creation of research questions, meeting with DACAMERA at DACAMERA to talk with them. What are they trying to know? What are they trying to learn? How can we work with them and their data to get answers to the questions that they're pulling forward? Setting up that data sharing, getting that exchanged across our organizations, developing and refining that research plan. Again, what we want to do, what the data allow for us to do, we want to make sure that those things are aligned. Going through that process of cleaning, curating, processing the data, going through analyses, and really a very important component of this is this ongoing communication that takes place. And what that looks like is cycles of results sharing. And so what we're going to be sharing out today, this is going to be new to many of you on this call. This is not new information for DACAMERA. We have had an opportunity to share with them multiple sets of findings, getting feedback on those findings. That's that partner input piece. And through that partner input, continue to refine and understand, what are the data showing? What do they mean? What is the research analysis helping us to focus on and learn? And so again, that partnership model driving the research that we are doing here, ultimately culminated in what brings us here today, which is this broader dissemination of the findings. And so that is our partnership model that we applied. And so let us now talk about what we did and what we learned. And for that, I would like to hand things over to my colleague, Jackson.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Potter. So for this study, our community partner DACAMERA provided us with 10 years of ticket sale data from their most recent season back to the 2016-2017 season. It included really important information such as unique customer IDs, the concerts attended with presentation details such as the venue location, and most importantly, the home zip code of each patron. To answer our research questions, we paired this customer data with American Community Survey data from the Census Bureau and matched on this zip code variable. In all, we had a total of 56,832 ticket sales that we looked at, of which 49,127 were able to be geolocated for our spatial analyses, and we were able to identify 13,142 ticket purchasers, who we refer to as patrons. Then lastly, this graph on the right here illustrates the top 15 ticket buying zip codes over this 10-year period. Next slide, please. So when we look at DACAMERA's ticket sales at large, we see some stark realities. Most tickets are sold to patrons who live inside of Loop 610, and those from outside tended to be from wealthier, more educated community contexts. There's also a lack of patronage in Northeast Houston. And then when we zoom into the loop, which is that bubble on the right, we see the Houston arrow displayed prominently. However, we do, and it's very important to note that DACAMERA still has a very solid presence in the rest of the Houston area and inside the loop, as evidenced by this pale yellow shading on these zip codes. And then if we look beyond just concentrations of sales, we can say that on average, DACAMERA's patrons come from community contexts, which are zip codes, where almost 60% of the residents have a bachelor's degree or higher. The poverty rate sits around 11.3%, And the weighted average median income is $99,462. It is especially important to note that we cannot know who exactly is purchasing tickets in these community contexts in a way that they could be belong to an extreme of one of these variables, or the people we measured could be perfectly average. So now I'll pass it off to Deja to preview our research questions and delve into the first one.
Thank you, Jackson. So these are our research questions. So to kind of give like a brief overview, we'll just be diving into the community context that the audience comes from. And we'll have three sub-questions that will go with that I'll discuss later. We also have our second research question that is just diving into just more of how far are they traveling to, and if we have different audiences from different community contexts also traveling to see the presentations. And then our third research question is what just keeps them coming back? You know, how many concert or single ticket buyers or single ticket that does it take to be able to get them to be a current or just recurring member of DACAMERA, and so on and so forth. So we can go into the first research question. So the first research question is just overall, what is the community context that the audience of DACAMERA's different presentations? And so I'll break that down into a few parts. So first, I'll give you a quick overview of the current season. Then I'll go into how that has changed over time. And then finally, I'll highlight how these aspects differ across the 12 venues that DACAMERA serves. Next slide, please. So before looking at the trends over time, I do just want to take a brief snapshot from the most recent season being the 25-26. So on average, as you can see that the audience are coming from areas where around 11% of the residents live below the poverty line, and 61% of those hold a bachelor's degree or higher. And then also nearly 39% of those individuals identify as Hispanic or Black. And so overall, this data just shows that the audience are coming from communities that are more educated than the regional average and just have a consistent poverty rate. And also we see a representation of Hispanic and Black patrons. So this snapshot right here just provides a good solid foundation as we move forward in the presentation. Next slide. So here we are looking at how things have changed over the last 9 seasons. So this graph right here is just going to bring together 3 factors, which is the poverty rate, the education levels, and also our combined measure for Black and Hispanic patrons. So what really stands out to me from this graph is how steady these lines have been over time. As you can see, the poverty rate has remained pretty constant at around 11% throughout the whole 10 years. For education, we've seen a shift. It started at about 56% back in the season of 2016, 2017, and has settled closer to around the 60s percent in recent years. So also the combined measure for Black and Hispanic patrons also have increased from around 36 from starting to about 39. So there also was a little dip around 2020 to 2021, which we want to take note of that being the pandemic period. So we know why that has probably taken place. But overall here, this story is just one of consistency. It does have a slight upward trend in both education and in Black and Hispanic populations over the years, but pretty steady overall. Next slide. So now in this slide, we're taking a closer look at how the poverty measures just vary across the different venues. So as you can see that most of them fall between a similar range, around the 10 to 11%. However, if you can look closer, you can see that Eldorado Ballroom and Miller Outdoor Theater are a bit different. Their figures are around 13 to 14%, which could explain to Eldorado Ballroom being located in Third Ward and Miller Outdoor Theater being a big venue that a lot of people in the greater Houston area know about. So the overall picture here is still just the consistency. There's not a major difference when it comes to the venue serving more wealthier communities or and those that are just more underserved. Instead, it just shows a steady trend throughout them all, with just a couple of venues that show a little bit more engagement than others. Next slide, please. And so this final piece of the analysis is focusing on the racial and the ethnic makeup of the zip codes that the audience comes from, which is categorized by venue. So as you can see, we have a consistent representation across all 12 of the venues, indicating that there isn't a single venue that is dominated by one certain demographic group. However, you can also see that El Dorado Ballroom does stand out slightly, which it attracts a higher proportion of Black and Hispanic residents compared to others. But this is just a matter of degree. It's not a completely different audience base. So ultimately, as I was saying before, just DACAMERA has been really seeing and maintaining a steady audience that spans across the different racial and ethnic backgrounds. And so now to get into our second research question, I will pass it off to my colleague Jackson.
Hello again, everyone. Thank you, Deja. So research question 2 is, does the genre of a performance attract patrons from different community contexts? Next slide, please. So initially, we had wanted to see if driving distance might affect the community context represented at a venue's audience. However, an initial analysis showed that the driving distance had very little effect. So we moved on to considering genre with the jazz versus chamber being kind of a binary variable. And to do this without the driving distance playing any effect or having any role, we had to choose a venue that had both jazz and chamber presentations, which is the Cullen Theater at the Wortham Center in downtown. So we did see, however, that at this venue, there were a lot more jazz tickets and presentations. So we were able to add Zilka Hall at the Hobby Center because that is a chamber-only venue. And as you can see from this map, they are very close together. So we can kind of consider that driving time and distance would be mostly negligible. And then I'd also like to note that we do see a clustering of DACAMERA's venues in central Houston in that map on the left. And then also it's important to note that all pandemic data was omitted from this analysis as it required people to attend in-person concerts, and that was not possible during the pandemic. Next slide, please. So to do this, we ran a t-test to assess the average patron's community context at these venues and compare them across the genres. We found that jazz patrons' community contexts, on average, have 6 percentage points higher proportion of residents with a bachelor's degree or more, 5% percentage points higher proportion of white residents, and a $5,791 higher average median income. So while it's important to note that a t-test statistical significance, and all of these were found to be statistically significant, it does not necessarily imply a substantive difference. These results do show that the jazz audience's community context at these venues tended to be whiter, wealthier, and more educated. And now I will pass the baton back to Will to bring us home on research question 3.
Thanks so much, Jackson. All right, so I'm going to be walking us through our final research question, which reads, at what point does a patron's level of seasonal engagement make them more likely to return to DACAMERA for a show the following season? And does this threshold differ depending on the genre of event that a patron attends? Next slide, please. So in order to really answer this question, we needed to find a way to measure seasonal engagement per patron. So what we did is organized a structured table that creates a logistic regression, which is simply just a model that is designed to predict the probability from a yes or no outcome. And we used DACAMERA's event data to say, will this patron come back to DACAMERA next season or not? That's the yes or no question that we're asking. And the table we use to create this logistic regression is made up of a few key variables that feed into this model. So really the most critical variable in the entire model here is returning next season. Does the patron return the following season if attending an event the current season? This is essentially our outcome binary variable. It's what the model is trying to predict. So for every unique patron season combination in the data set, we assigned a value of 1 if that patron returned the following season and a 0 if they did not. It's really the key variable that the model is using to predict the question of does this patron return to a DACAMERA event next season. Which brings us to season order, which is simply a control variable that accounts for the fact that the data we use spans the most recent 10 years or 10 seasons of data dating back to the 2016-2017 season of DACAMERA. Notably, though, the most recent season, the 2025-2026 year, was intentionally excluded from the model. This is because, if you remember, since the returning next season variable is defined as whether a patron shows up the season immediately after the current season, that means patrons in this 10th most recent season have no future season to return to. There's no real data yet that confirms if a patron returns to DACAMERA. And then we have two interaction variables here called events per season and audience type. And these two variables work together as the key predictors in the model. Events per season counts the number of unique, distinct concert events each patron attends within a given season. And audience type classifies each patron into one of three audience type categories: patrons who exclusively attend jazz events, patrons who attend exclusively chamber events, or mixed, which is based on if a patron attends at least one jazz and one chamber show in a given season. And these two variables together test the relationship between events attended and how the return probability looks depending on what type of music a patron prefers. Say, does a patron come back more frequently if they attend strictly jazz concerts? Will they come back more frequently if they attend chamber concerts, or a mix of both? That's kind of the question we're asking here. And from here, the model will estimate a separate curve for each type of genre that the audience attends. So once the logistic regression was ran on this table, we took the predicted probabilities it generated and we plotted them visually that you will see on the next slide. So here you'll see the predicted probability curve. And I kind of want to walk you through what each line here is telling us. So first off, just to get a general idea of the graph, the x-axis shows the number of distinct events a patron attends in a given season. The y-axis is showing the predicted probability that they return the following season. And that red dashed line at the 50% mark is really the critical threshold here, where if a patron is above 50%, they're at the point where they're more likely than not to come back next season. If they're below that 50% line, it means they're less likely to return next season. So kind of starting with that yellow line, that shows our jazz only, our exclusively jazz patrons. This group here shows the quickest path to loyalty of the three. So after attending about just 3 to 4 distinct jazz events in a single season, the average jazz only patron will cross that 50% threshold and is predicted to return the following season. And you'll notice that here for both the jazz only and the chamber only curves, they're noticeably steep in the early events, meaning each additional jazz or chamber event attended in a season has a significant incremental impact on their likelihood of returning. And then you'll see it'll flatten out a bit at the top at around 7 to 8 events. We can see that both jazz only patrons and chamber only patrons as well are approaching near certain return rates. Their loyalty is pretty much locked in at that point. And again, kind of go back to chamber-only patrons in blue. They are following a slower path than jazz-only patrons, but it's still fairly steady and reliable. They don't cross that 50% threshold until about 4 to 5 distinct chamber events in a given season. So roughly about 1 to 2 more than a jazz-only patron would need. But still, again, this curve is climbing steadily throughout, approaching around 90% return rate at 10 events, essentially. So they are taking a bit longer to convert, but once they're engaged, they demonstrate engagement fairly well. And then you'll notice this green line here, which represents mixed patrons, those who attend both jazz and chamber events in the same season. It features the most linear curve here. And you'll notice this curve begins at two events rather than one, which is very much intentional, since by definition, a mixed genre patron must attend at least one jazz and one chamber event. A single event observation is logically impossible for this group, so we opted to exclude it. And it crosses that 50% threshold at around four distinct events, which is actually faster than chamber-only patrons, a little bit slower than jazz-only patrons. So overall, big picture here, all the curves here show that with sustained engagement, loyalty will very much become secure over time. Now I'm going to pass it off to Eugen, who is going to cover the main takeaways of the study.
Thank you, Will. So to bring everything together, here's a short summary. First off, you have a pretty rock solid foundation because when you look at the past 10 seasons, even through a global pandemic, economic fluctuation, and major demographic shift across Houston, the demographic makeup barely shifted. So basically, as Deja mentioned in the very beginning, the core audience consistently comes from highly educated, economically stable and fairly diverse neighborhood, averaging 60% with college degree, only 11% poverty, and about 39% minority representation. This means you've got a super loyal core audience that's just right there for you. And second, as Jackson highlighted earlier, certain values matter. Spots like Eldorado Ballroom draws from slightly more diverse community contexts. And when looking at genre, jazz music actually attract patrons from slightly more educated and wealthier community context. Third, building on what Will just showed us, we found a number for keeping those fans. So if you want someone to come back next season, the tipping point is 4 events for jazz and 5 events for chamber. So once they hit those numbers, they're over 50% likely to return. And finally, the mixed genre attendees. Our data shows they grow slower, which is largely owing to a high proportion of 4 series subscribers in this group. And here's our short summary. And now I'm going to pass it over to Leo.
Thank you, Eugen. My name's Leo Boucher. I'm the Director of Marketing and Audience Development here at DACAMERA. I'd like to again add my thanks to everyone at the United Way and the Kinder Institute and Rice for their participation in this project. It's been very illuminating for us. I'll say right up front that my takeaways are evolving even during this presentation, so bear with me. But if we can go to the first slide, I'll talk about some of our current takeaways from our participation here. So we, as was mentioned, we had a kickoff meeting, and that was a long, detailed discussion of sort of what kinds of research questions DACAMERA had, what kind of questions we would like to answer. We had a lot of discussion about our community programs and our young artist programs, and about our concerts and what we had data for. And part of the, as that conversation progressed, we realized that our ticketing and donation data, which live in our customer management system called Spectrix, are a really rich set of data that could be very fruitful to be analyzed by the folks at Kinder Institute. So and we learned as we went along, as you saw in the type of analysis that was done. And there were other steps along the way where we saw different kinds of graphs and different kinds of analysis that were done. It showed that our data can be analyzed in a lot of different ways to provide insights into our patrons and their behavior. I would add I remembered working on or hearing the presentation today that while our data is great and we have a lot of ticketing and donation data for 10 years, there was still a considerable amount of work in making that data explicable and analyzable by the folks at Kinder Institute. We had to spend a lot of time, for example, in our data, it wasn't always clear that a subscriber one season was also a subscriber the next season. And we had to do a lot of detailed work to say, yes, this data point means a subscriber was someone was a subscriber in 23, 24, and then it was different in 24, 25. So there was a lot of work in standardizing and making the data readable to folks. But I did want to say that we appreciate the fact that we have this rich data set, that we have it all collected in one place: ticketing, donation, attendance, and even attendance at some free events. The geospatial analysis, yeah, a couple of things. One thing that occurred to me today was this emphasis on the sort of consistency of the representation and community context in our patrons over the years. And I think that is something that would be valuable for us if we were going into, say, a strategic planning process, to know that this has been the consistent context for our audience. If and that would be helpful in setting goals if we were wanting to change the representation in our audience from those different contexts. But I did also zero in pretty specifically on this idea that we do have some overrepresentations in zip codes with a high rate of low-income people, because it kind of rang true with some data we have from our recent subscriber survey that showed that 12% of our subscribers had a household income under $50,000. Which was quite surprising. It doesn't seem like it's the typical profile of a subscriber to a performing arts organization. And it just made me think about the fact that we want to be careful about when we increase our prices. Earned revenue, ticketing revenue is an important part of our income. Concert ticket prices, as we all know, have risen rapidly in recent years, which means that we can get more income for tickets at our concerts, especially when we have big stars. But we also want to balance that with the fact that we want to keep our concerts accessible to people from many different contexts. So it's a good check on as we think about our pricing model in future seasons. Can I go to the next slide? Yeah, you saw a lot of analysis about the customer journey. Like all performing arts organizations, patron retention is probably our number one strategic challenge. Getting people we have a lot, as all our performing arts organizations do, we have a large segment of people who come once and never come back. As you saw, that likelihood, if someone just comes to one event, is as low or lower than 10%. So it's a big challenge to get people to come back. So to me, it confirmed the importance for us to redouble our efforts to get people to return for a second or third event. I mean, I know you saw that tipping point that might have been 4 or 5 events. I sort of zeroed in on the idea that if we get to 2 or 3 events, we're very close to a 50% chance of them coming back. And so my goal would be to increase the number of people who come to 2 or 3 events so that we get more people who are more likely to come back. So it makes me think about the tactics we're using. That might be discounts that we offer to get people to come to more than one concert, personalized outreach to what we call our multi-buyers or multi-show purchasers to get them to come back. because clearly anything we can do to get them to come to a second or a third, never mind a fourth concert, could have a huge payoff in future seasons. And there's a very interesting result here about the mixed genre patrons, that they are very close to 50% chance of returning if we get them to come to 2 or 3 events. And that kind of rings true with an idea that we have about what you might call a DACAMERA person who appreciates the variety of what we do, attends different genre. They aren't strictly a chamber music person or a jazz person. So makes me think about any tactics that we can use to encourage people who come to a jazz concert to come back to a chamber music or classical music concert and vice versa, or even to experience different kinds of subgenres within classical music, say contemporary classical or what you might call more traditional classical music. Seems like it would increase their likelihood of returning. Yeah, so those are the observations we had. Again, really appreciate the work of the team at Kinder and Rice on this and the support of United Way. And we'll turn it back to Jessica and we can get into whatever questions people have.
Great. Thank you so much, Leo, for tossing it back to me. And I will also join the parade of thank yous. Very much thank you to the team from DACAMERA for participating in the case study, for being vulnerable with us and asking your questions, sharing your data, to the team from Kinder Institute and Rice University's Master of Social Policy Evaluation Program, all their time and contributions to this. We certainly wouldn't be here without all of those players and parties. And so thank you so much. Before we jump into the Q&A, we want to highlight and bring together. Leo shared some takeaways that they're going to bring back into the camera. And it's, as we sit here and listen, like, well, what can other nonprofits learn from this case study and from the experience we have here? And DACAMERA was our first performing arts-based organization that participated in the case study. And so very big round of applause to them. And thank you to them for that, for being our first in on this. And DACAMERA really exhibited 2 traits that we often talk about in coffee and quality, especially when it comes to the data practice for strategies for collecting and using data, and the overall data collection and utilization of data. We talked about this first takeaway for nonprofits in our last week's Coffee and Quality quarterly virtual session. It's not uncommon for nonprofits to have data across multiple systems. Sometimes that data is forced. It's a forced design with funder requirements where you have to have different systems. And other times that's by staff design for different rhymes and reasons. But this desire to have one source of truth really kind of sits around the space of collecting data, utilizing it, and having that there as the space. And, Leo mentioned Spectrix, and that really was the space where all of their information was coming out of for the case study to help answer the questions they were having. And it was just this remarkable set of data from the past seasons. I think it was like 10 years worth of seasons. And so it was just this excellent example about being consistent with entering your data in the same location. I know, just to share a little bit behind the scenes as well, like they had a change in their system as well as during one of those seasons. And they were really clear on like, well, this is what happened and this is how that migration looked. And having that nuance, having that ability to have it still funneling through one source of truth just really helps set you up for the long run to be able to use your data that you've been collecting. And so this really came through in the spirit of the case study. I think this is just like an excellent example of like, what does that look like in real life? What does that look like in practice, and helping to understand that? And then just also in the like spirit of what Leo said too, because as he was sharing like his findings and the takeaways for DACAMERA were also evolving as he was hearing the presentation. Another one kind of came to my mind from this, and also in the spirit of this one source of truth, because where we store our data is extremely important to the ability to use it, but then also the nuance and the need to standardize and to have readable information that reflects what you're doing. It just really highlights the importance of the documentation of procedures for analysis for reporting. We can't underestimate that. That data practice plus data dictionaries are something that we don't often talk about, but are so critical in order to use your data, answer questions with it. And so just again, DACAMERA is an excellent example of like this one source of truth and having the ability to use your data. Um, the second takeaway that we have for the nonprofit sector is just, again, DACAMERA was amazing at this, and the encouragement to support that you are the expert in your organization, your mission, the work you're doing, and be curious about who you're targeting and who you're reaching. They were really considering this like notion of like, well, are we serving who we intended to serve? Are we getting into the communities that we want to see, this diversity in our audience? And they had that question and just being curious, like, what way is this going to go? What could this look like? And just being in that space, the desire to better understand your participants, and in DACAMERA's case, your audience was just really shining through from this case study. And so that was something that, other organizations can really learn from and serve as an example. So thank you for that. Thank you to those. So those are our takeaways for other nonprofits. We are now going to transition into the Q&A. So there's a couple of questions coming in through the chat, and love that those were able to be asked and answered. So thank y'all for that. But my first question coming into this as well goes to DACAMERA. And you hit on it a little bit, Leo, but would love for you or Brandon or Sarah to just continue to expand on, were there any findings from the study that challenged or confirmed what you thought you knew about your audience?
I would say it confirmed everything we knew that we thought we knew, and not necessarily in a good way. It just shows that, like it shows areas where we can improve, where, I think we internally we say, oh, we need to improve here. And maybe I think anecdotally we think we are, but maybe we're not
Mhm.
to the degree that we think we are.
Yeah.
Something that I was thinking about watching the presentation is, and just for some background for everyone, I'm kind of the main grant writer here, so I get asked a lot about who we're serving, and I'm trying to answer that question, and we have like they were saying, there's thousands and thousands of ticket sales, and we're not able to go out and give a demographic survey to every single person that comes to our audience, so that's a difficult question. And I just appreciated the usefulness of being able to partner with such an incredible institution like the Kinder Institute to be able to analyze zip codes so that I can have a more confident response to that question. I think that is a lovely thing that they came out. And I think that's an interesting thing to think about. Like if you're in a similar boat where you're dealing with a lot of numbers, like to consider zip code analysis.
And I would say one thing that I would like to add that as we've seen, this is only our patrons at concerts, and as I said earlier, we have this whole separate kind of wing of what we do, community and education. And in our kickoff meeting, we were trying to figure out, well, how can we analyze this as well? And that seemed to be kind of bigger than we could wrap our heads around for this case study. So, maybe part two of this study, or we can, now that we have this, we can try to focus on that internally, but, how that data would be distinct from this data.
Thank you for that note, Brandon. I think that you just continue to model, again, being curious and being comfortable with like what way is the answer going to go, like this examining the anecdotal knowledge that we have, like that comes up for so many people. Everyone has this like, well, anecdotally we say this or anecdotally we think this, but like really, like let's look at the data. Let's really see, let's stand next to that toe to toe and just wait to see what the answer is, you know? And so I just, again, you continue to model that. So thank you. Thank you for that.
Jessica, if I can hop in, I know this is a
Mhm.
question for DACAMERA, but
Yeah.
I just think that this is one of those things that for so many nonprofits they grapple with. And like both what Sarah and Brandon just shared, I kind of just want to lift that back forward, which is, with Sarah's point, sometimes I'm going to have a ton of data, but I'm not going to have certain key pieces of information that I might want out of that data. And so, are there things that I can do? Are there other data sources that are out there and available that I might be able to bring in that don't fill in the blank perfectly? But just as Sarah was talking about, it's going to give us a lot better idea about an answer to a key question we have. Again, in DeCamera's case, they're focused on who are the communities? Where are the communities? What are the communities we are serving? Bringing in census data, which again, understandably that can be a little bit tricky, but there are ways of going about doing that. All of a sudden starts to fill in blanks that we might not otherwise have. And so I really appreciate Sarah you bringing that up and bringing that forward. And for me, I think of that as like that applies potentially in other nonprofit situations where they're going like, I know this person's from this zip code, or I know they're from this county, or I know they're from this, but I might not have a ton of other information. And so how can I bring in other things to help us understand who are the communities we're serving? And to Brandon's point that he was just lifting forward, there is this amazing other again, all the facets to Kamar was outlining, this awesome facet about community and education and in schools and free concerts. And I remember that kickoff meeting, Brandon, we're sitting there talking and we're this like my head is running wild with these. And then it was like, okay, well, what data do you have? Like, what's the information? And it was like, oh, yeah, like, mm, yes, good question. What do we have? What do we know? What could we? And like, again, to Jessica, to your point, that beautiful launching point into like, okay, if we are interested in understanding all of these different aspects of what's going on, what does that data look like? What are the questions we need to be asking, the data we need to be collecting? What are the ways we could go about collecting it to give us additional insights into what we're doing? And so, again, we had this awesome opportunity with this capstone to focus on one facet, one dimension of DeCamera's work. I just really think it's important that what Brandon and Sarah are pulling forward here is like so many nonprofits have that multi-dimensional, multi-facet structure, and sometimes you're going to have rich data, and one of them that you might think about like how can I leverage some of that knowledge into thinking about and broadening or expanding the data that I'm collecting in other dimensions and other facets. And so thank you both Sarah and Brandon for pulling that forward. And again, like those have been some of the things just tossing around in my head and thinking about what are we learning and how do those learnings really reach out beyond just today and just this capstone to thinking about, nonprofit experience more broadly.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you for adding that in, and thank you for pulling forward like the use of community data, because that was something that was leveraged in this case study. And so my next question I want to toss to the team from Rice to just really expand on that. Like y'all use community data to better understand the people and communities DeCamera was like that was showing up in DeCamera's audience. And so if another nonprofit wanted to do that, right, like they want to leverage that ability, where should they start? What advice would you give someone who's just beginning that journey to use community data?
There are a variety of sources, and Will, my colleague Will, was the one who helped us work with, in this case, census data, and so he can share a little bit about that. I think one of the key features for us was having, needing to go through the process of what are the unique connections that we can make. And so in this case, DeCamera's data had zip code tried and true for each one of their ticket purchases there. And so that gave us that linkage opportunity. It does not require zip code, though. Again, we were sort of talking earlier. Do you have a county? Do you have a city? Do you have, I mean, we can obviously get much more granular. Do you have a full address that might allow for you to very specifically geolocate where someone is and open up opportunities for bringing in other information? Um, previewing tomorrow's presentation just a tad bit, like that was one of the things we did with voter precincts. Again, a much more granular geography than zip code, but it's sort of what does the data allow us to do to be able to bring in additional information of who is getting, who lives, what are the contexts, what are the communities that are going there. And so, Will, I don't know if there's more you want to sort of share about like what was that process and sort of going through, reviewing, looking for ACS. I know one of the things that we had to grapple with was with 10 years of data, how do you bring in ACS data to correspond not just to zip code, but to year as well?
Yeah, I mean, definitely looking at the ACS data at first can be a bit overwhelming because again, it is so much. It's like 10 years of data. It's what it's called is ZICDAs or zip code tabulation data. So it's just pulling from, you know, uh, geographic approximations of postal zip codes. It's all this information. But what we did to make it more manageable in DACAMERA's case is we used the zip code data. We filtered out any location that wasn't from uh, any state other than Texas. And what I did is handed it off to my partners, Jackson and Deja, who were really in charge of that geographic approximation using straight line distance to find, the distance between a DeCamera venue and a unique patron's house. And maybe they can talk a little bit more about how they used that straight line distance and geographic approximation for their research questions.
I can jump in here. Yeah, so having this data, being able to take DeCamera's data, which had a wealth of information about all of the shows that people attended, kind of their address, like whether or not they were a subscriber, and being able to take that and have a unique like variable to merge this ACS demographic data allowed us to look at these community contexts, as we call them, each zip code, and kind of align people and sort them into where they live and what it looked like. And then with 10 years of data, we were able to kind of generate a snapshot of what it looked like each year. And that was kind of a lot of what Deja was talking about, that demographics don't tend to change very much over a 10-year period. And we kind of saw that reflected.
And so in terms of like specific locations, data.census.gov can be a really powerful source. More locally, there is the Urban Data Platform that is here at the Kinder Institute. Self plug there, I
Self plug.
suppose. But that's a resource that if organizations are not interested in grappling with all that is the data.census.gov website, the Urban Data Platform will have things that are more Houston specific and focused. There is also the Federal Reserve of St. Louis, Fred, has a lot of databases there that have those sort of unique geographic features that can be merged on. And the BLS website is the final one that I would sort of throw out there. Again, a lot of it's going to be what am I trying to know? What am I trying to learn? And at what geographic level? But those are going to be some of those sources that are readily available and differing levels of ease in terms of how do I bring in and connect it with data that you all might have as a nonprofit organization.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Those extra resources, Dan, at the end. I appreciate that. And BLS, if I didn't know what that means, what does that mean?
Bureau of Labor Statistics.
Thank you. Thank you for that.
Yes.
And I'm sure we can pass around those web addresses so folks can have those resources as they go about their merry day and start to use community level data within their data sets. So, but I also do want to like lift up Jackson and Will. Like, thank you so much for like kind of walking through and talking through how you approach this, what this looks like. Sometimes it's just the act of like, well, how do you do this? Like, what's my first step? Where do I start? And I really appreciate how y'all lifted that up. And then, yeah, the straight line approach, this is the second case study that had this kind of come up. And so love that we have two examples of using that approach within the case study world, coffee and quality world, world. And so very excited to have that. That's my self promotion plug of like the great case study knowledge that's coming out. And so, thank you. I'm going to jump back to DACAMERA, but please feel free to like drop in the chat questions or come off on mute. Would love to hear other folks' voice. But DACAMERA, we're going to stay in the spirit of advice. And so what advice would you give other performing arts, cultural nonprofit organizations, or if you want to go wild, go all broadly, more nonprofits, right? What advice would you give them if they want to learn more from the data they're already collecting? If they want to start getting curious about their data, right? Like, what advice would you give them?
I don't know that this is advice per se, but I don't know. I felt like I was surprised at the amount of data that we had. And, I know Sarah and I, as we went through coffee and quality, I felt like we were both like, oh, we don't have data. We don't, we have so much data. And, I think it was just a question for us as to, oh, we do have all this data. How do we use it at that point? So, I think for us, like it was just kind of taking that first step as to really, data had never really been a priority for just internally. And we get it as nonprofits. We're trying to get to do the mission. We're trying to survive on a daily basis. So, once we were able to kind of focus on actually, okay, we're gonna engage with our data. How do we do that? And then it was just kind of taking the first step. And then it was kind of, oh, there's this whole wellspring of information that we have here that we can utilize. Let's dig in.
I guess that there's two pieces of advice I think about. One is, I have been at DACAMERA for a long time. Several years when I worked here many years ago, we had our data. If somebody called in with a new email address, it had to be, we had the email list one place, we had our donation and development data another place, we had our ticketing data somewhere else. There might have been more. It had to be changed in at least three places. When we were able to convert to a unified customer relationship management system where all that data could be in the same place, it was enormously helpful, saved us a lot of time and energy. So I guess my advice is if you have the opportunity to do that, take it. We were fortunate to be able to move to Tessitura at that time where we could put all of that stuff together. The other one is I've been here through at least three migrations of customer management systems. In one of those earlier transitions, we, meaning me, decided for some reason that I cannot explain now that we didn't need to migrate all of the history data into the new system. And we regret that to this day. So I guess my advice is always err on the side, if you can, of migrating as much data as possible into a new system, even if you can't at the moment think why that would be important. So that's my advice.
I can throw in something brief, which is like coming from the perspective of someone that's gone through the full Coffee and Quality Fellows program and has been engaging with coffee and quality a lot, is of course like keep engaging with coffee and quality. But I think in general, in performing arts or any nonprofit, this feels so overwhelming, like in general, like all this data work. And I think what I've really learned through this is that you just have to start, you know, like we're been working towards getting like an annual report, and I've over time been coming up with these little impact reports, and like, yeah, it doesn't look like where I'd like it to be eventually, but I have it, you know? So it's like, just start where you are, start small, and it can grow. And something we talk about a lot in coffee and quality world is continuous quality improvement. And it's that concept has really stuck with me and I find it really helpful. You never really arrive, you just keep going.
I have kind of a big open-ended question, which maybe needs to be tabled for another day. But I would be very curious to ask Dan and the team, assuming this is the first time you did this analysis with a performing arts organization, I wonder if there were places where you thought, oh man, if they only had this information in their data, we could have done X kind of analysis or answered this kind of a question, um, or wouldn't it be cool if we knew this because then we could analyze that? And were there any of those that we could take back to know, like that we could start trying to collect that kind of data or get access to that kind of data about our patrons that would have enriched this even more?
Asking a researcher what data they want is such a dangerous question. I mean, I think that the short and sweet answer is all the data, but that's not your all's mission. Your mission is not to collect data for us to to do capstones with. I mean, to me, I reflect just back to the stuff where in so many ways, like your all's questions can really drive that answer. When you all are grappling with who are we serving? What are the communities we are serving? I mean, Leo, you made a phenomenal comment earlier that I thought was just so powerful around like strategic planning. If we're sitting there in our strategic planning and we're thinking about who are we serving, and we've got this data that's painting this picture of like the communities that you're serving today are the communities you've been serving for the last decade. And if you look at that and you go, and that's what we're trying to do, then you have that, you've got the data, you've got sort of your answer, and like, cool. But that if you, sorry, but's probably the wrong word there. If in that case, however, you all are thinking, actually, we would love to mix this up a little bit. Like how do we move those lines a little bit? I don't want it to be 11% poverty. I want it to be 30% poverty. I want these communities that may not otherwise have access to the type of art that you all are helping bring and feed into the Houston community. What does that mean? Where do we go from here then? And it's such a powerful insight that you're sort of like reflecting on in that space of like what we're doing is doing what it's doing. And in some ways, I think a big part of what we found here was that was a big finding, was that consistency piece. There wasn't one season it was this and one season it was that. The patrons weren't changing all over the so if that's the case, then there does open up that really large question that DeCamera can sit with around, is that what we're trying to do? And if the answer is yes, again, like cool. If the answer is like, well, maybe we could explore something different, also cool, but it opens up that like, so then what does it mean? Is it about finding venues that aren't U of H, they're not Rice, but are they Houston Christian University? Are they the Woodlands? Do we need to run up north? Do we need to run down to Pasadena somewhere? Do we need to think about something going on in the Sugarland area? What are the opportunities there? And again, part of it is because you all have this data now that's showing consistency, that were you to begin messing with some of those variables, you could immediately look at information coming back in and going, oh my gosh, we are seeing unprecedented numbers of tickets coming in from these zip codes and this part of the area versus, oh my gosh, it's the same zip codes. They followed us to the Woodlands. They hopped on 45 and came on down to Pasadena. And now that offers interesting insights too about the sort of the returning and the loyalty and the DeCamera patron. Again, all these sorts of questions start firing off. And so, there's obviously, again, as the researcher, you're always like, more data, more information. That's always great. But I think you were really pointing to something really important, Leo, earlier around as the camera is sitting with this information and thinking about what it's doing and where it's going. Like, it does offer that opportunity to think about, oh, are there mechanisms that we could be playing with that, what does it mean for us to double down on jazz? What does it mean for us to look for other venues? What does it mean for us to fill in again, this is you all's expertise. I'm sorry, I'm totally over speaking in that regard, but like, I really did appreciate that thing you were lifting forward, Leo, because I felt like that's just such an awesome question to be grappling with from a data-driven perspective. So yeah, those are my reflections on sort of what we were thinking about and learning through the project.
Thanks, Dan. Want to jump into, Will, Jackson, Eugen, Deja. Do y'all have any reactions or thoughts to that as well? Because I did. I don't want to jump in line. If y'all had thoughts, I was like, say it, because y'all were very deep. You spent your whole summer in DACAMERA data set. So thank you for that. But I really appreciate what Dan was lifting up there around like, how are you going to use this? What would you use this data for? Like that was like the note Leo was giving about strategic planning and like trying to understand that. And I heard at least 3 times yesterday, Allison Mattingly asked that to someone, like, how are you using that data? How are we using the data? Like knowing how you're going to use it or the potential to use it. That's a note to always kind of look back and reflect on of what data should we be collecting, right? It brings that together. Because yeah, for some folks, data is amazing and a wonderful and like give me, all. But others, when we have all the things to do, that's a little challenging, right? Except for when you're migrating data. Leo, I want to underline that. Like that is the time to like bring all the data in. I can tell you too from experience, like data migration, bring it all. Even if you don't think, nope, bring it all. Because there's going to come a moment where they don't give you access to that other data system. And it's that same day you're going to need something from there. So please do that. But yeah, thank you. So I'm checking the time, seeing if there's any other questions from the audience, but really thank y'all again so much for sharing your time with us, sharing your experience, perspective. Really thank you so much too for lifting up, Brandon, place the priority on this, like the data you have, how you're going to use it, continuous quality improvement. Sarah, like thank you for those notes. I think this is just like excellent examples again of like how other nonprofits can take their data and learn from it and use it. And so thank you all very much. We have, as Dan mentioned, or someone mentioned, we do have another case study presentation tomorrow. So this summer was full of data fun for the Masters of Social Policy Evaluation program students. And so we have our case study presentation tomorrow with Collective Action for Youth, same time, same channel. At 1 p.m. I dropped the registration link if you'd like to join us there. And then as always, your feedback is a gift. So please share any feedback you have with us on the presentation, future quarterly virtual sessions. Would love to hear from you. So with that, thank you again so much to the team from Kinder Institute, Rice, and of course, all my thanks and appreciation to the team from DACAMERA. Thank you so much. And I hope everyone has a wonderful rest of your afternoon.